Even now, after everything that's happened, I still believe my Uncle Thomas was a good man. Thomas, of course, is just a pseudonym. My uncle's real name is one that you might recognize if you watch the news regularly. Although he never had a PR team or security detail, he was famous enough that my parents warned me to never tell strangers who he was. A few times, unscrupulous reporters even cornered me after school, hunting for juicy gossip about his private life. To me, their questions didn't make any sense. Uncle Thomas wasn't some formidable figure standing behind a podium. He was just the fit, middle-aged guy with glasses who ran the barbecue on the 4th of July. If someone had asked me what was special about him, I would have talked about how his clothes always matched, and how he always remembered to call you on your birthday. Maybe it was that thoughtfulness that always made us kids feel so comfortable around him. No matter what went wrong, Uncle Thomas would find a way to take care of it. Or so we thought. Back then. Every year, I looked forward to spending my vacations at his estate in the country. It wasn't just the swimming pool, the huge backyard, or the 2-story house with so many echoing rooms to explore. It was getting to hang out with my cousins, Sam and Brady. Sam was just a few months younger than me, while Brady was 2 years older. And the three of us had been getting into trouble together ever since before we could walk. Then, one summer night, Brady unveiled a secret that would change our lives forever. The three of us were laying on the floor of Sam's room, feeling sluggish and lazy from eating too much of Aunt Ellen's delicious pineapple cake. We were all wide awake, but for once, none of us had any idea about what to do next. The adults had switched out the lights and told us that it was bedtime, but their bedroom was too far away for them to hear us sneaking around. The night was ours, and we knew it. Brady suddenly sat up, a big smile on his face. He had found something earlier that day, he told us. Something we had to see to believe. Even in the dark, I could see Sam rolling her eyes. Lately, Brady had been lording his age over us, acting like turning 11 had given him some special knowledge that Sam and I lacked. I didn't want to take the bait, but the curiosity was too much. I asked him what the hell he was talking about. That's when he told us about the trapdoor. He said that he found it earlier that day while we were playing hide and seek. It was in the middle of the woods, inside a shed, and somebody had left it wide open. It was the only thing that could have gotten us up and moving that night. Brady led the way, tiptoeing downstairs while Sam listened for any sign of movement from Uncle Thomas's bedroom. When we reached the front door, I hesitated. We had tiptoed around after dark before, but I had a feeling that if we got caught outside the house, the consequences would be a lot worse than a light scolding. By the time we reached the end of the driveway and turned into the woods, I was starting to get really worried. The feeling of slick fern sloshing against my pajamas, and the whir of so many cicadas, made the forest feel much more wild than it did during the day. And out here in the country, that black night sky felt infinite. None of us had thought to bring a flashlight, but Brady knew where he was going. I hoped. In a starlit clearing up ahead, I spotted an electrical pylon with a small shed underneath. It was a squat, forgettable gray structure, the kind that I had always assumed was just for maintenance. But as Brady tugged the door open, I realized that there was a faint glow coming from the floor. A trap door. Something suddenly felt wrong about Brady's story. Why had the last person to use the shed forgotten to lock it behind them? Maybe there hadn't been time, I thought. Maybe they were so upset or frightened by what they had seen below, they hadn't thought to lock it. Before I could give voice to my fears, Sam and Brady heaved the trapdoor open with a screech. The ladder descended into a wide, well-lit tunnel. There was no dust here, no cobwebs. Whatever the place was, it was used frequently. Swallowing my fear, I climbed down behind my cousins. Something about the cylindrical, interlocked sections of wall seemed unsettlingly similar to the corpse of some giant insect. There were lights at regular intervals, But how could we be sure that they wouldn't suddenly go out? I had no idea how big the place was or what it was for. But even at only 9 years old, I knew that it must have cost a fortune to build. I thought about security guards, arrest, looking at my shoes while I explained to my Uncle Thomas that I hadn't been brave enough to tell my cousins no. Up ahead, the tunnel opened into a large, sphere-shaped room. We had walked out onto its second level. There were benches all around us, arranged in a way that reminded me of spectator seating. On the true floor of the room, about 20 feet below, were 14 metal columns arranged in a circle with a drain in the middle. It reminded me of something. Something I'd seen for the first time just a few weeks before, while my parents were watching the movie Gladiator. A coliseum. But what was it doing here? In the middle of the woods near my uncle's property? We shouldn't be here, I told my cousins, and my words echoed eerily back at me from the bare metal walls. Be here, be here, be here. Brady called me a crybaby, but he was also the first to start retreating back the way we came. He was just as unnerved by the place as I was, but he hadn't wanted to be the first to admit it. We all breathed a sigh of relief once we closed the trapdoor safely behind us. From the safety outside the shed, the whole thing felt like some sort of surreal nightmare. 20 minutes later, we were back in our beds, all aware of the unspoken agreement we had made to never share what we had found with anyone else. The next morning, I found myself wishing for the first time that my stay with Uncle Thomas would end early. Sam, Brady, and I had woken up with a sort of queasy, unclean feeling. It affected Brady the worst. He burst into tears at the breakfast table, and stormed back upstairs to bed. When Uncle Thomas asked what was wrong, I wanted to tell him everything. Then I saw Sam glaring at me over her cereal bowl. If I confessed what we had done, I would be losing my cousin's trust forever. And I didn't think I could bear that. I was an only child, and Sam and Brady were the closest friends I had. What would I do without them? What would I look forward to, if not this? I mumbled something about how we'd eaten too much cake the night before, then trudged to the bathroom to splash water on my face. I avoided looking at the mirror, sure that if I glanced up, I would see some horror from the tunnels hovering behind me. Keeping my eyes on the sink, I wiped off my hands and went back to the kitchen. By mid-morning, that nasty feeling had begun to fade. By late afternoon, I could almost convince myself that I had dreamed the whole thing. Uncle Thomas was concerned that the three of us had been fighting, so he was especially indulgent, even letting us stay up late and play video games on the big TV in the living room. That's where he found us in the morning, asleep on the carpet with all our secret fears forgotten. No unspeakable things from underground had come creeping up to the big French windows. No armed guards had shown up to take us away. Maybe things were going to be okay after all. Brady, Sam, and I managed to keep our vow not to mention the tunnels until the next winter vacation, when our families all gathered at Uncle Thomas's house to celebrate the holidays. There was more than enough space for everyone, a real wood-burning chimney, and an excellent hill for sledding behind the patio. The only problem was the weather. One grim day of sleet followed the next, without a single flake of snow. Then, one windy night, I woke to the feeling of cold hands reaching beneath the blankets and tugging on my feet. It was Sam. She was whispering something about lights in the sky. Brady stumbled in after her, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and we all rushed to press our faces against the frosty glass of my bedroom window. Sure enough, faintly glowing orbs were descending through the blackness outside. The three of us looked at each other, all thinking the same thing. The lights were headed directly towards that shed. After they landed, the blackness of the winter night was so absolute that it looked like they had never been there at all. Before Brady or I could stop her, Sam sprinted down the hallway toward Uncle Thomas's bedroom. Brady and I exchanged a miserable glance as she rapped lightly against his door. She was going to tell the grown-ups everything. We were about to be grounded until next Christmas. When Sam returned a few moments later, however, she was alone. She told us how nervous Aunt Ellen had become. She told Sam that Uncle Thomas had an emergency at work. He wasn't home, and whatever it would have to wait until morning. There was no way that his absence was a coincidence. It had to be somehow related to those lights in the sky. Sam, Brady, and I swore that we would stay up until Uncle Thomas got home. But beneath cozy sheets on a moonless winter night, that was easier said than done. None of us lasted until dawn. At some point in the early morning, however, I woke up to the sound of movement in the hallway. Heavy, adult footsteps. They were stumbling and uneven, like my own father's after he'd had a few drinks too many. Whoever it was, they were sobbing. They were trying to cover up the sound, but there was no stifling that kind of deep, chest-shaking agony. I was about to wake Sam and Brady, but something made me hesitate. If it really was Uncle Thomas out there, would he want his own kids to see him like that? I rolled over and eventually fell into a fitful sleep. At breakfast, I was surprised to find Uncle Thomas looking fresh, clean-shaven, and chipper in his favorite bathrobe. He had made pancakes for the whole family, and whistled as he heated them up in the skillet for us. It had snowed overnight, a light dusting that left the ground still covered with more mud than white. Uncle Thomas raised an eyebrow when Brady announced that we were going sledding, but he just toasted us with his mug of coffee and turned back to the other adults. Sam and I both understood that it was just an alibi. The real goal was to investigate the shed. The frozen muck made our journey tougher than in summer, and when we arrived, we found a shiny new padlock on the shed's door. For a moment, no one spoke. Brady gave a little shrug as if to say, "Well, I guess that's it." Then, Sam pulled a small keyring from her pocket. She sorted through the keys, frowning, then settled on a tiny brass one. It matched the lock perfectly. She had found it, she admitted, on top of her father's dresser. Uncle Thomas had been in there the night before. We were sure of it. Suddenly, none of us wanted to know what those tunnels were for. We walked home in silence. And for almost 2 years, we stayed away from the shed in the woods. If my cousins noticed any more lights in the sky or nighttime excursions by Uncle Thomas, they didn't mention it. Like many children of busy, successful parents, Brady began acting out as he got older. Maybe he wanted his father to pay more attention to him than polling numbers and quarterly reports. Or maybe his life was just too easy, too perfect, and he felt a need to shake things up a little. Whenever he wasn't grounded or suspended, he began hanging out with older kids whose idea of fun was more than a little frightening for Sam and I. One of them, a pale boy named Tanner, once ran up behind an elderly man and slammed his skateboard into his head, just to watch him fall. On another occasion, Tanner's girlfriend Katya threatened to break Sam's arm if she didn't steal makeup for her from a store in the mall. Sam didn't really believe that Katya would do it, but with Brady's new friends, you could never be sure. Sam didn't understand what was happening to Brady any more than I did. For us, it was like losing a best friend. That was why, when Brady said that he had no plans for his 15th birthday, we both experienced a sinking feeling. He would be doing something. We were sure of it. Just not with us. Uncle Thomas prepared a delicious birthday dinner, but Brady was so sullen and sarcastic that it was painful to sit through. Laying in bed that night, I heard a backpack zipping and the clinking of bottles. There was a faint knock on my door. To my surprise, it was Brady. He murmured that he was going to throw a little party, if I wanted to come. I didn't like Brady's new friends, but I was touched that he had invited me. I agreed, without considering where my older cousin might be taking me. After we snuck out of the house and down the driveway, Brady took a flashlight from his pack and signaled down the road. Another flashlight answered back. Tanner, Katja, and a guy named Derek slouched toward us. The little group clapped Brady on the back. They ignored me completely. Maybe it was just my imagination, but they seemed a lot happier to see Brady's stolen booze than to see him. We headed into the woods. I felt confident that Brady wouldn't be stupid enough to lead strangers to the shed, but I was wrong. Soon we were back in that familiar clearing. Brady flashed a bad copy of his father's keys and told his friends to watch this. I tried to stop him, but it was too late. He shoved me away and opened the door. If I was scared, he sneered, I was welcome to go home. Derek snickered, but I had already made up my mind. I was staying with Brady. Not because I wasn't afraid of what might be inside those tunnels, but because I didn't want him to go alone. Or even worse, with those 3 idiots he called friends. The tunnels beneath the trapdoor seemed completely unchanged since our last visit. Tanner hopped onto his skateboard as soon as we reached the bottom of the ladder. Its wheels echoed eerily as he coasted up and down the cylindrical walls. Derek poured some of Uncle Thomas's 15-year-old whiskey into a bottle of Coke, then passed it to Katja. Tanner attempted a kickflip, failed, then stuck his middle finger out at Katja when she laughed. We reached the Coliseum room. Brady made a sort of improvised rope by knotting our jackets and hoodies together, and we climbed down into the central space, with its central and 14 ominous columns. We tried banging on them and even pushing them over, but we still had no idea what their true purpose might be. Brady's friends were starting to get bored. Tanner grabbed Katja's hand and told us that the two of them were going to go exploring. When Brady tried to go with them, Katja just laughed and tripped him up. My older cousin had drunk far more than he could stand, and hit his head when he fell. But the two of them didn't even look back. Derek spat on the floor and cracked open the second bottle. Brady groaned, and I helped him to his feet. I had never seen my older cousin looking so hurt or angry. It was as though, all at once, he had seen his new friends, as Sam and I saw them. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, running footsteps came echoing down the passage that Tanner and Katja had taken. Shit, someone's here, Tanner hissed. Katja stumbled along behind him, still buttoning up her shirt. I looked around for a place to hide, even though I already knew it was hopeless. Our only chance was to get out of the tunnels before we were caught. Unbelievably, Brady's makeshift rope held. We scrambled back up it and toward the ladder. But we were going the wrong direction to escape what was coming. I didn't recognize the men and women who were with Uncle Thomas. At least, not right away. The only thing that was clear to me was that they were well-dressed, important, and utterly shocked to have encountered us in the tunnels. They traveled with guards, linebacker-sized men in suits who thought nothing of pinning 5 teenagers painfully to the cold metal floor. I caught a glimpse of a gun at the hip of the man with his knee on my back, and understood immediately that he would blow my brains out in a second if ordered to. Uncle Thomas shouted something, and Brady and I were released. As I climbed to my feet, I got a better look at the murmuring men and women gathered around us. I had seen some of them on television. You probably have too. The bald, brutal-looking security chief wanted to know about Tanner, Katja, and Derek next. Uncle Thomas looked at his son, but Brady shook his head. His voice was icy, as he told his father that he had never seen the 3 of them before in his life. I like to think that, at the time, he had no way of knowing what the consequences of his words would be. Uncle Thomas knelt down and put his hands on our shoulders. We were coming with him, he explained. He didn't like it any more than we did, but it had to be done. It was the only way for us to truly understand what this place was. He warned us not to speak, not to move too quickly, not to draw attention to ourselves in any way. No matter what, he emphasized, and we took our places among the rich and powerful. The sphere-shaped room was full of quiet murmurings. Most of Uncle Thomas's guests seemed just as nervous as we were, and when I saw what was happening in the Colosseum below, I understood why. 13 people were being let out from the same passage that Tanner and Katya had used for their tryst. Bulky figures in full hazmat suits used cruel-looking cables to bind them between the columns in an X position. Their arms and legs were pulled taut. They were totally unable to move. The captives glanced at one another, confused, and I realized that Tanner, Katya, and Derek were among them. The scene was like some sort of obscene art installation. I tried to look away, but Uncle Thomas gave me a nudge with his foot. A warning that I had to watch what was about to happen, whether I wanted to or not. That sick feeling crept back into my gut. It was like the gravity of the room had somehow changed. My hair stood on end. A rumbling, metallic groan came from somewhere in the structure, and I finally understood why the space had such a strange shape. Its ceiling spiraled open, revealing another wide, vertical tunnel. Something was coming down it. Uncle Thomas tightened his grip on our shoulders, although whether it was out of protectiveness or an involuntary gesture of fear, I had no idea. Above us, a dark form blocked out the artificial light. I couldn't have said what color it was or described its shape, except by comparing it to something else. One Thanksgiving weekend, years ago, my cousins and I had been playing basketball in the driveway when a strong wind blew our ball away. When we finally found it stuck in a storm drain 10 years later, it was blackened by slime. The tendrils of some invasive plant had grown around it and hung off its warped surface like dozens of spindly legs. The thing descending into that room was similar to that basketball, except that it was the size of a small house. Faint lights shifted beneath its mottled surface and at the end of its limbs. The same lights that Sam and I had seen in the sky all those Christmases ago. It emitted a maddening, high-frequency humming sound, one that seemed to reverberate in my bones. Just like that morning in Uncle Thomas's kitchen, I wanted to puke, to scrub myself raw just to get the feeling out of me. Without being fully aware of what we were doing, Brady and I grabbed each other's hands and held on tight. It lowered itself into the center of the 13 bound figures, who were staring at it with even greater horror than we were. For a while, it just floated there, doing nothing, and then the captives ringed around it began to scream. I couldn't see why. Not at first. Brady squirmed beside me, fighting to get down to the Colosseum floor to somehow help his one-time friends. But Uncle Thomas held him fast. That's when I noticed that the captive's skin was becoming pinker. It melted off of them in frothy, fatty layers that puddled on the floor between their flailing feet, producing a smell that was horrifically similar to frying bacon. 7 layers, each more painful than the last, until all 13 of them had transformed into flayed husks that looked like something out of an anatomy textbook. Their eyes rolled wildly in their crimson faces as the thing drank in their agony. The worst part was that every one of them was somehow still alive. It felt like it took them hours to die. When it was all over, the thing drifted out of the room just as mysteriously as it had entered. The high society observers around me were shaken, although not so much as I was. I realized that they must have seen this spectacle before. As the hazmat-suited figures returned to clean up the mess, Uncle Thomas shepherded Brady and I away from the gruesome aftermath. There was so much I wanted to say, so many questions I wanted to ask him, but I was afraid I would puke all over my shoes if I tried to open my mouth. Nobody knew where the things came from, or what they wanted, Uncle Thomas explained. The prevailing theory was that they drew some kind of pleasure or energy from human suffering. Because wherever they went, that was what they caused. Individual people, families, even whole communities. It didn't matter. The thing slaughtered them all by the most grisly means possible. What we had seen was tame, Uncle Thomas assured us, compared to some of the incident reports he had read. Billions had been spent trying to cover up their existence, trying to fix the damage, and trying to fight back. Brady and I stared wide-eyed, as Uncle Thomas admitted that a lot of the military training exercises and nuclear tests that we had seen in the news were just that. Attempts to somehow destroy those monstrosities. None of it had worked. It wasn't that it had made them angry. Even more chillingly, it was as if the things hadn't noticed the attacks at all. They simply continued their reign of terror, until a well-connected researcher thought up these places, and convinced the powers that be to implement them. Our footsteps echoed hollowly through the strange, segmented tunnel. Uncle Thomas's hands were shaking, and a clammy sweat had broken out on his forehead. I had a nasty feeling I knew who that well-connected researcher might be. We needed to understand, Uncle Thomas insisted, that those people we saw chained up down there might as well have been dead already. They were captured terrorists, war criminals, even human traffickers. Some of them were people like Tanner, Katya, and Derek who had stumbled on the secret by accident, but those deaths couldn't be helped. This was the only way to stem the slaughter. The only reason we weren't down there with them, my Uncle Thomas reminded us, was that he had vouched for our silence. As we walked out into the night, I couldn't help but think about how many people disappear without a trace every year. I wondered how often those disappearances coincided with the strange lights in the sky. I wondered how much Uncle Thomas wasn't telling us about his little experiment. Crossing the yard with its dewy, fresh-cut grass, tiptoeing upstairs, and crawling beneath the cool sheets felt like a dream. I wished it was a dream. I wished that I could wake up having forgotten what I now knew. The smell of coffee and homemade breakfast roused me from sleep. It was a beautiful summer morning. Beams of golden light filled the hushed hallway. The rest of my family must already be in the kitchen, I thought. Rubbing sleep from my eyes, I trudged down the stairs. Brady, Sam, and Aunt Ellen sat around the kitchen table, hideous skeletal grins on their faces. Their bodies were as red and raw as the 13 victims in the tunnels. A miniature version of the thing from the tunnels floated in front of the stove, wearing Uncle Thomas's apron, flying strips of flesh in 4 separate pans. "I'm gonna throw a little party tonight," it said in Brady's voice. "Wanna come?" I sat up in bed with a gasp. It was not yet dawn. Somewhere in the blue darkness, someone was vomiting heavily. Brady. I hurried down the hallway to the bathroom, where I found my older cousin bent over the toilet. He looked up at me with bleary, bloodshot eyes. "We couldn't let Sam find out," he grunted. "Not ever." Another sour blend of whiskey and birthday cake splattered into the porcelain bowl. I knelt beside Brady and held back his hair. We would keep Uncle Thomas's secret, I agreed. Even from our family. Even from our best friend. When Sam saw our faces the next morning, she knew something was wrong. But she knew better than to ask. I didn't understand how Uncle Thomas could be his usual chipper self, joking with Aunt Ellen, and flipping French toast as though he hadn't seen 13 people tortured to death only hours before. The glance he gave Brady and I as we slouched into the kitchen made his expectations clear. We were to act as though none of it had ever happened. I was happy to do as he asked. Pretending that the whole thing was a bad dream or a hallucination was the only way that I could keep on living my life. The more time that passed, the easier it was to convince myself that the lie was true. Brady, meanwhile, was suddenly studying again, talking about scholarships and careers. He was following in his father's footsteps. Looking back, maybe that was sort of a warning sign. A cry for help. Maybe I should have seen it coming. After Brady left for college, I hardly ever visited my cousin's place. That big, beautiful house felt haunted by too many memories, and Sam and I had little to talk about anymore. The disappearance of Tanner, Katya, and Derek was in the news for only a few weeks, but I saw their faces every time I looked at my Uncle Thomas. His hair was growing whiter, and sometimes I noticed dark circles under his eyes. But otherwise, he was the same cheerful, charismatic figure I had always known. His experiment, it seemed, was still working. Then, 2 weeks ago, a series of unexpected events shook our family to the core. It began with good news. Brady was finishing his master's program and had already received job offers from 2 prominent NGOs in the capital. Before anyone could congratulate him, however, disaster struck. Uncle Thomas suffered a heart attack while running in a local marathon. He died on the way to the hospital. It was a strange death, especially considering Uncle Thomas had no prior history of heart problems. But Aunt Ellen's response was even stranger. In a short message sent to the family chat, she informed us that she was going on a spiritual retreat in Europe. The loss had been too much for her, she explained, and she needed to find herself again. Brady would be left in charge of the funeral arrangements. Disappearing in the midst of a crisis wasn't like Aunt Ellen at all, but we all knew that tragedy affected everyone differently. The funeral was a somber, understated affair. There were no $1,000 bouquets, no marble monuments or long parades of attendees. Uncle Thomas's powerful friends showed up in simple black suits and dresses to offer their condolences to my cousins. But his passing didn't even make it into the local newspaper. As important as he may have been in life, in death, Uncle Thomas was just another corpse. During the ceremony, my thoughts weren't with my family. They were with a small shed on the outskirts of Uncle Thomas's property. What was going to happen to the top-secret program now that its founder was gone? Would Brady and I be trusted to keep Uncle Thomas's secret? Or were the same people who had shaken Brady's hand going to send assassins after us tomorrow morning? 2 days after the funeral, Brady invited me back to the old house for a visit. It was a gloomy, gray afternoon, and with no cars in the driveway or lights on inside, the place looked abandoned. The well-tended yard was the only sign that anyone still lived there at all. Zipping my jacket up beneath my chin, I knocked on the door. Brady opened it immediately. It was almost like he had been waiting for me in the lightless hallway. He welcomed me, his voice grim and oddly formal. He was wearing rumpled old work clothes, and it looked like he hadn't shaved or combed his hair in days. I asked where Sam was. Out, he shrugged, then asked if I felt like taking a little walk. I didn't, especially not if we were going where I thought we were going. But it felt wrong to turn Brady down. I wasn't dressed for stomping around in the woods, but my tennis shoes would have to do. With a sinking feeling in my gut, I followed my older cousin down an unmarked path that was becoming all too familiar. There was nothing to be afraid of, he told me. The lights only came at night. I wanted to ask Brady why we had come back to this horrible place at all, but I felt sure that my older cousin would explain himself once we were inside. He opened the shed lock with my Uncle Thomas's key, and we climbed down the ladder into those well-lit, eerily pristine tunnels. Brady had claimed that we would be alone, but he still seemed nervous. He kept glancing from side to side and fiddling with his pockets. As we walked, he asked if I remembered what Uncle Thomas had told us. What he'd said about how protecting humanity from those things was more important than just a few lives. I nodded. Just thinking about that night made me feel sick. It was a shame, Brady reflected, that his father couldn't live up to his own ideals. When I asked what he meant, my older cousin rolled his eyes. I didn't really think that all of the project's victims were death row psychopaths, did I? The logistics would have been impossible. And besides, those things needed to be fed far too often. It was a shame, though, that Uncle Thomas didn't just let himself believe the lie. It was a shame that he had to start causing problems. I didn't like where the conversation was going, and something else was bothering me. I was sure that I could hear footsteps following us. They were faint, as though whoever it was didn't want to be noticed. And from the way they followed just out of sight, it was clear that they knew these tunnels well. Brady stopped suddenly and put a hand on my shoulder. In a way, he explained, his father had died as soon as he started having doubts about the project. I didn't have any doubts. Did I? My older cousin pulled a syringe full of clear liquid from his pocket. He was sorry, he said. Sorry it had to end this way. Couldn't I see it was for the greater good? He lunged at me with the needle. The stealthy footfalls became a sprint, but there wasn't time to worry about what was behind me. I had a feeling that if Brady got that needle beneath my skin, I would turn up dead of a heart attack as well, if my body was even found. Brady might have considered it a mercy killing. Better that my life end this way than chained up in the presence of one of those horrors from beyond the stars. I never had a chance to find out. Sam ran up behind her older brother and swung the fire extinguisher like a battle axe at the side of his head. An awful clang reverberated through the tunnel. Brady dropped, unconscious, to the cold metal floor. The extinguisher fell with a clang beside him. Sam clutched her knees, panting. Brady had been acting strange all week, she explained. He had waited until she had gone to visit a friend before inviting me over, but she had come home early and found my car in the driveway. Sam had guessed immediately where the two of us had gone, but she had never imagined that her brother could be capable of something like this. For the greater good, he'd said. I shuddered. Tears were streaming down Sam's face. I took a step forward to comfort her, then froze. Brady was moving again. He lurched to his feet, gripping the syringe like a knife that he was eager to plunge beneath Sam's skin. Blood streamed down the side of his face from his wound. There was nothing of the cousin I thought I knew in that fanatical expression. Sam had gotten lucky with her first swing, but neither of us was as strong as Brady. He kicked me in the stomach when I tried to grapple his arms, then charged his sister. I was still gasping for air when he plunged the needle into her chest. Sam's eyes opened wide. They didn't close again. Brady turned. Whatever poison was inside that syringe had already been spent, but I could tell from the look in his eyes that he would kill me with his bare hands if he had to. I ran. Moments later, I was scrambling up the ladder, my hands slick with sweat. I was almost back to the shed when I slipped, barely managing to grab the middle rung as I fell. I clung to it, heart racing, and felt cold fingers wrap around my ankle. Brady threw me to the floor, an insane look of triumph on his face. He threw me to the floor and lifted a booted foot above my neck. Then Brady wavered. His eyes went out of focus. He stumbled woozily backwards and collapsed for a second time. Even now, I don't think Sam meant to kill her brother, but a blow to the head is always a serious thing. In Brady's case, it took several minutes for the hemorrhage to make its effects known. Too late for Sam, but long enough to save my life. I crawled back up the ladder and locked the shed door behind me. Outside, a light rain. I wanted to go home, but No place was home anymore. Or ever would be again. My uncle's organization would be back to finish what Brady started in the tunnels. I only hope that when they come for me, it will be quick. A syringe, a garrote, a bullet to the back of the head. Anything. A waking up chain between two columns in a round metal room. Knowing that one of them is on its way. Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/JordanGroupHorror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward. And if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you, which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. And see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.